In what was once a quiet hamlet in rural England, the dead are being carted through the muddy streets. Inside one particular dwelling, a man lies on his back, delirious from the effects of a very high fever. He struggles to breathe. Sounds emanate from him that can only be described as a death rattle. Suddenly, he vomits blood on the floor, the motion exposing what looks like egg-sized buboes covering his body. He will be dead within a day or two, as will his wife and his 3 children, as will his best friend and neighbors, as will most of the people in the surrounding areas. What we're talking about is the Black Death, a disease so virulent and deadly, to some it looked like the world would end. Black Death. You can easily imagine why folks in parts of rural England in the 1300s must have thought that this killer pestilence was the end of the world. Around 90% of people back then lived in small rural communities, and the Black Death in some cases wiped out the entire community. As one chronicler put it, parts of the countryside were quite void of inhabitants so that there were almost none left alive. Can you imagine what that must have been like? No one knew what was coming. The Black Death, actually not called the Black Death back then, was a bubonic plague that entered England from the south and made its way through the country at a frightening speed. It wasn't as if these rural communities had much warning. Word didn't travel too fast back in 1348. Some of those small villages, perhaps with populations of up to 500, were completely depopulated. In the larger towns, and certainly London, some people had been hearing rumors about a terrifying pestilence that had been sweeping through Europe, but the rural folks didn't know what was coming. This is how another chronicler put it when talking about one particular place. Almost the whole strength of the town perished. In other towns, there weren't enough people living to bury the dead. The plague then traveled further north, with one bishop writing at the time that he saw no one from one town because they were all dead. It traveled to Scotland too, a country at the time that had been warring with England. Scottish soldiers had said the disease was God taking vengeance on the evil English, but those soldiers carried it home to Scotland. The plague was an equal opportunist, and it killed the Scottish with a similar ferocity. One Scottish chronicler later wrote in 1348, "So great a plague has never been heard of from the beginning of the world to the present day, or been recorded in books." Estimates vary, but it's thought that in England alone, the Black Death killed 40 to 60% of the population. It killed something like 30 to 60% of Europe's population. And so you can imagine that at the time, people must have wondered if this was not the end of the world. Plagues in general. We're not going to go through every plague that must have made people wonder if humans didn't have long left, but we'll mention a couple. You have the Plague of Athens that lasted from 430 to 426 BC. No one is exactly sure what the disease was, but it killed over a quarter of the population of Athens, and it killed those it affected very quickly. That was, some ways, good news, because the hosts died so fast they couldn't spread it around too much. Then there was the Plague of Justinian, which lasted from 541 to 750. This was certainly a bubonic plague, which relates to those swollen lymph nodes we talked about that looked like tumors. The name for this kind of swollen lymph node was a bubo, hence bubonic plague. During the time it ravaged Europe, it took with it half of the population there. People might well have thought, this thing will never stop, it will kill us all. The Great Plague of London, that lasted from 1665 to 1666, killed around 100,000 people, but that was actually around 20% of the people that lived there. While Londoners back then might not have thought the world was going to end, they would have certainly wondered just how bad things could get. Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the USA were creating stockpiles of nuclear weapons, there was always an overhanging fear that someone might just press the button and an all-out nuclear war would take place, with it possibly ending humanity. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, people were always a little concerned that nuclear war could happen, mainly because the TV kept showing them infomercials about what to do in the event of such a war. Those programs were damn scary too, if not a bit ridiculous at times. We're not sure if the duck and cover technique would have saved someone from a nuclear bomb, but the ad certainly put the fear of God into people. It was in the 60s when things really came to a head. By the way, there have been a bunch of what are called close calls, but this was the closest. From October 16th to October 28th in the year 1962, there was a standoff between the Soviets and the Americans. It's a long story, but let's just say that the USA had prior to '62 watched as Fidel Castro's Revolutionary Army turned over a Cuban dictatorship and introduced a revolutionary socialist state. Well, that really upset the Americans, who certainly didn't want Cuba getting into bed with Soviet communists. And that happened anyway, much to the chagrin of the US. In 1961, the Americans secretly directed an invasion of Cuba led by Cuban rebels, and this became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. It didn't work, is the short explanation. After the invasion, Castro got in touch with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Together, they agreed to construct ballistic missile launch facilities in Cuba, sites that weren't that far from the USA. The US already had launch sites in Europe that weren't that far from Russia. When the US found out about the Cuban facilities, you could say the White House and the Pentagon weren't exactly happy about it. The US demanded that the facilities be taken down and the missiles be sent back to Russia. Knowing that the Americans had launch sites in Europe, Khrushchev said he wanted to level the playing field. And so if the US decided to attack them, what would now happen was mutually assured destruction. The very apt abbreviation and acronym of that is MAD, or MAD. What you might not know is that the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Department of Defense wanted to just go ahead with a full-scale attack on Cuba, thinking the Soviets wouldn't fight back. The missile sites soon became known to the public and the people started getting scared. If you were around in those times, you would have seen President John F. Kennedy on the TV speaking to the nation, and his words were, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." Damn, people might have thought, are they really gonna do this? Things heated up more, and then a Soviet spy said it seemed war was imminent and asked US officials if some kind of agreement could be made, rather than a nuclear war kill many people. Meanwhile, the US military's top brass were still pushing for an all-out attack on Cuba. Khrushchev wrote to Kennedy discussing how they made a tight knot of tension and it needed to be untightened. He wrote, "If there is no intention to tighten the knot and thereby doom the world to the catastrophe of the thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot. We're ready for this." There's much more to the story, but in the end, Kennedy agreed to remove the missile launch sites from Italy and Turkey and not invade Cuba, only if the Soviets dismantled their launch sites in Cuba. Diplomacy won in the end, but we weren't so far from nuclear war. How would that have gone down? Some years later, an American political scientist wrote the U.S. airstrike and invasion that were scheduled for the third week of the confrontation would likely have triggered a nuclear response against American ships and troops, and perhaps even Miami. The resulting war might have led to the deaths of over 100 million Americans and over 100 million Russians. Maybe that's not the end of the world, but what would have happened after that? December 21st, 2012. And now for something completely different, and even a bit silly. We say silly, but the polls at this time revealed that 10% of the people interviewed thought the world would end on this day. And you might ask, what was so special about December 21st, 2012? Why not June 6, 2007 at 4:26 p.m., starting with an exploding sausage factory somewhere outside Lyon in France? That made about as much sense. This was what you might call a doomsday scenario. It involved a large number of very misguided and misinformed people who thought the end of civilization was imminent. It was going to end that day because they said this was the day that the Mayan calendar ended. It had run out of spaces, so to speak, and they said there wasn't another edition. This was complete balderdash, to use a word we think people should use much more frequently because it sounds so cool. The calendar didn't end at all, and any expert on Mayan culture could have told those 10%ers that, but they weren't listening. They were prepping instead and busy writing horrible things about so-called Mayan apocalypse deniers. Some people around the world actually had one last big party on December 20th. Strangers let their hair down and made love in the streets. Some sat quietly at home burning incense sticks while listening to One Direction's Take Me Home. Others were less accepting of death, and photos emerged online of them down in their bunkers with all the food they'd hoarded, only for the sun to come up the next day and leave them wondering what they were going to do with 300 boxes of mac and cheese. Weirdly, people in the city of Mérida, Mexico, the place where you'd have found lots of Mayans, were just going about their business as usual. It turned out that one loon had misread some Mayan text and another loon shared that loon's prophecy, and the rest was history. We found out then that in the age of the internet and social media, a person can read an alleged holy inscription on a Dorito, and soon they'll have a maddening crowd of followers. The followers of this theory didn't bother reading the words of one of the world's leading Mayan and Mesoamerican specialists, a man who said, "No Maya text, ancient, colonial, or modern, ever predicted the end of time or the end of the world." Y2K. At the stroke of midnight, when the year was January 1st, 2000, some people were hunkering down waiting for the apocalypse to happen. This time, it wasn't about ancient theories, but modern technology. The theory was that something called the Millennium Bug would wreak havoc on our highly digitized world. There actually was a slight problem, in that coders in the early days would not write something like 1997, they just put 97, because that saved space. But what would happen when 2000 came along? Would 00 actually mean 1900? Or would this bug shut down and mess up certain computer systems? Some people thought it would. What had to be done was a lot of coding to fix the problem, but for some reason people thought computer systems all over the world would just freak out. They saw a doomsday scenario with nuclear power plants the world over exploding, missiles going off, banking systems breaking down, etc., etc. It would take us back to the Dark Ages or something like that. One woman in the US saw this happening and started hoarding early. She told the press, "If something happens and I didn't prepare my family, I just couldn't live with myself." She even kept her hoarding of goods secret from her friends and neighbors, believing that when the lights went out, the unprepared would hit the streets in mobs and take what they wanted. There were some hitches in some systems, but all in all, the day after 2000 was just like any other day, other than the fact that a lot of people had huge hangovers. Next year. Okay, so we'll finish this with a prediction for 2021. That is the predication of an American pastor of the Mariners Church. He's got the rapture checked on his Google Calendar for some time in 2021, and it's kind of like the Leftover show where a bunch of people just go missing. In this case, it'll be the Christian believers who get hoovered up to the heavens, and the rest of the non-believers, or people of any other religion we imagine, will have to stay down on Earth and eke out a living amongst floods, plagues, and earthquakes, and the Great Toilet Roll Wars. We added that one. Before you start getting worried, remember that the Earth has been experiencing floods, earthquakes, and plagues for a long time, and they're not going to go away. Anyway, we'll just see next year if a bunch of folks disappear into the heavens. Just to let you know how long things have been happening down here on Earth, and to answer a question you all want answered, watch this video. Why do you even exist? And if that's a bit heavy right now, have a look at this one instead.